Good evening, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Sheldon Chambers, and I will be your host today. I will be joined by Clare Adamson, MSP for Motherwell and Wishaw, and Brian Duguid, um, William Goodard, writer and commentator. But first, I'm going to do our daily report on Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry said on Monday that its forces had taken control of the village of Tabivka in Ukraine's Kharkiv region, but Ukraine denied this. Vladimir Fityo, head of communications for Ukraine's ground forces, said this does not correspond to reality. There are battles taking place near this locality. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned on Monday that Ukraine's gains over the last 2 years of fighting were all in doubt without new US funding as NATO chiefs visited to lobby Congress. The European Parliament is investigating claims that one of its members spied for Russia's FSB since at least 2004. Tatiana Zdonka, a Latvian MEP, has denied allegations published by The Insider, a Russian investigative newspaper which put together the story along with Estonia's Delphi, Latvia, Ari Baltica, and Sweden's Expressen. Insider alleged emails between Zdonka and Russian case officers included reports on her work as a European legislator, including fostering pro-Kremlin sentiments. In March 2022, Zdonka was one of just 13 MEPs out of 705 in the parliament who voted against condemning Russia's war on Ukraine. Politico quoted a European Parliament officials as saying investigations have been opened into the allegations, which were taken very seriously. In a video on Facebook, Zdonka said, "I have never been associated with the KGB, and I have not cooperated in any other intelligence agencies." Representatives of the EU member states will meet on Monday evening to discuss funding for Ukraine as pressure mounts on Viktor Orban to agree. An aide to Orban said the Hungarian Prime Minister said he was open to a proposed 50 billion euros aid package and has sent a proposal with caveats to Brussels. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba met his Hungarian counterpart Peter Szijjártó in western Ukraine on Monday. I was wondering, what will be the consequences to Ukraine if they don't get this support aid from EU or America?
Who would you like to speak here?
Sorry, Claire.
So we know how difficult the whole war has been for the Ukrainian people. It's very worrying that it very quickly has gone off the news agenda, especially in light of another terrible conflict in Palestine and what's happening in Gaza. But we need to remember that the Ukrainians are a key strategic position in Europe in relation to Russia. I know that the Finnish people are very worried about what's happening with the border with Russia. And I think that the West needs to put their support behind the Ukrainians at this time and ensure that we don't forget what's happening there and that we continue to give them the support that they need to defend themselves.
William, what do you think?
I would agree with that, and it's grinding very slowly towards decisions being made on this. And it's interesting that Antony Blinken should have made a statement again today to say that the gains of the last 2 years that Ukraine has made in defending itself would most likely not be sustained if the funding didn't appear. I think it's a sticky thing in the US because of being tangled up with the coming election and with the possibility that Donald Trump might get in and everything then changes. From an EU perspective, it does seem to be a steady negotiating, trying to make sure there's as close to unanimity as we can get. And Viktor Orban of Hungary is very important in that, because he's the one that needs persuading. I think probably there will be something in the end, but whether it's enough to make a change in the war, or just something that means it just trundles on, and yeah, occasionally it will slip out of public view, and that's what happens with the headlines. But it is a key event going on at the minute that really needs to be resolved in the end. And at the moment, it's just, if you like, marking time. So this is all part of that, and part of the generally confused world situation in which we find ourselves.
Thank you. We're going to go to Israel and Gaza now. A total of 26,751 Palestinians have now been killed and 65,636 wounded by Israeli military action in Gaza since the 7th of October, the Gaza Health Ministry said. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society has reported that a woman has been killed and 9 others injured by shrapnel from Israeli tank fire near Al Amal Hospital and its headquarters in Khan Yunis. The Palestinian news agency Wafa reports that 100 bodies returned to Gaza by Israeli authorities have been buried in a mass grave in Rafah. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said today that Israel would not withdraw forces from the Gaza Strip or free thousands of what he described as Palestinian security prisoners, pushing back against media reports on some conditions of a possible truce deal with Hamas. Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister, has told members of the Knesset that Israel intends to retain military control of Gaza after the war and run in the same way it runs the occupied West Bank. Gallant said the work inside the Gaza Strip, where Israel claims to be clearing out Hamas terror infrastructure, is finite and was making progress despite challenges. Israeli forces dressed in doctors' scrubs and women's clothes have killed 3 Palestinian militants in an undercover operation in a hospital in the occupied West Bank city of Jenin. An Israeli border police unit made their way to a room on the 3rd floor and shot all 3 men in the head using pistols fitted with silencers in an attack that took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Israel said that the dead men were Mohammed Jalamana, a spokesperson for Hamas military wing, Bassel Ghazwawi of Islamic Jihad, and his brother Mohammed. All 3 were allegedly active in the umbrella force known as the Jenin Battalion. The medical director of the West Bank hospital said they were executed in cold blood. Protesters have been at the Karim Shalom border crossing between Israel and Gaza for the 7th consecutive day. The group, including family members of some of those being held hostage, is seeking to block the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza Strip. The UK has said it was alarmed by a conference held in Jerusalem on Sunday calling for Israeli resettlement of the Gaza Strip and voluntary migration of the Palestinian population elsewhere, which was attended by several Israeli cabinet ministers. Yemen's Houthis are ready for a long-term confrontation with the US and UK, a commander said in the statement. The World Health Organization has urged donors not to suspend funding to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, after Israel accused some of its workers of taking part in Hamas's 7th of October attack. Now was not the time to abandon the people of Gaza, the WHO spokesman Christian Lindemir said at the briefing in Geneva today. Is there at all a chance for peace in the region at the moment? Claire, sorry.
But I think it's such a difficult situation, getting more difficult, I would say, by the day. You can't forget that this started with an awful attack on a peaceful festival in Israel. So you can understand the anger at that time. However, the response of Israel, I believe, is completely disproportionate. And now there are questions being asked about war crimes. And we also have to ask questions about the blockade um, into Gaza, and a safe passageway for refugees to come out. I hope that we as in the SNP continue to call for an immediate ceasefire and for the negotiation. And it seemed that we were quite close to that, or getting closer to it last week. But at the end of the day, I mean, the level of the destruction in Gaza and what has happened to the infrastructure there means that it's very, very difficult to see how things will be resolved in any kind of timely manner, and that it will be years, if not decades, in the making to rebuild what has happened in Gaza. But I really hope that a peaceful, the ideal for me would be a two-state solution. I really hope that we can end these hostilities and see fewer innocent victims.
William, with all that's going on, is it possible to have a two-state solution anymore?
I think it would be better than a one-state solution. I think there is no clear path at the moment to a sustainable peace and a way forward for both the Palestinians and the Israeli people, which is a shocking indictment of the rest of the world's treatment of the situation in the Middle East, really over the last 75 years, because it didn't just start on October the 7th, although that was indeed an atrocity. The roots of this go back well before that, and they will be very difficult to unravel. In the interim, I think there is a chance, because I'm just hearing it more in the news reports, that there will be negotiations for some form of ceasefire. I don't think it will be a permanent ceasefire, but it might be a ceasefire slightly longer than the one that we saw just a couple of months ago. And some of the statements that are being made by Benjamin Netanyahu are part of that negotiating procedure. But there have been talks going on with Egypt and Qatar and the US and Israel in Paris. And it looks as if there may be some progress getting made. I think possibly also Israel may be beginning to understand that certainly if their goal is to have the hostages released, those who are still alive, possibly the military campaign is not the way to do it. And also, if they want to eliminate Hamas, which is their other stated objective, I don't think that's happening either with the military campaign as it is. And it's quite likely that even if they did all but eliminate Hamas, something else would spring up. You do not do this to a people. You do not virtually genocide a people. And we can now start talking in those terms following the ICJ interim ruling without there being a reaction. And so the way to this is through negotiation, but the negotiations, I wouldn't like to be involved because they are just so complicated and so fraught with danger. But negotiations there must be. And at some point, hopefully soon, at least a temporary ceasefire there must be.
Claire, on the International Court of Justice ruling, where does the SNP stand on that? Are they in support of it, or do they think it should have gone further?
I don't know what the party position is. I think any progress in this area is to be welcome, but it's really important that the UK government urged Israel to lift the blockade in Gaza and allow critical life-saving aid, and that we can remind the UK government and continue to put pressure on them about the grant of arms licenses to Israel and doing everything it can to ensure that the people there and the refugees are treated with dignity, and that we know some of the behaviour has bordered on war crimes that I hope will be investigated in the future.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to Northern Ireland, where the UK government and the DUP reached a deal to return Stormont government back. Sinn Féin has said a united Ireland is within touching distance as the party prepares to claim the post of Northern Ireland First Minister for the first time. Mary Lou MacDonald said today that the expected restoration of power sharing in the wake of a deal between the Democratic Unionist Party and the UK government came amid a historical turning of the wheel that would unite the island. According to a speedy political choreography that is supposed to unfold at Westminster on Wednesday and Thursday, her deputy, Michelle O'Neill, could become the First Minister of Stormont Executive by the weekend. That will be a moment of very great significance, not simply because we haven't had government for so long, but because it will be the first time that we will have a Sinn Féin First Minister, a nationalist First Minister, MacDonald said. O'Neill became the region's punitive First Minister when Sinn Féin overtook the DUP as the biggest party in the 2022 Assembly election. But a DUP boycott to a protest against post-Brexit trading arrangements mothballed Stormont. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson signalled an end to 2 years of deadlock early today when a tumultuous meeting of the party's 130-member executive endorsed a deal to revive power sharing. The deal will remove restrictions on the movement of goods within the UK, Donaldson said. That was our core key objective, and I believe that we have represents real change, and everybody will be able to see it for themselves. He has promised zero checks, zero customs paperwork on goods moving within the United Kingdom. The DUP endorsement is conditional on 2 statutory instruments at Westminster to give legislative effect to the Downing Street commitments on trade and sovereignty. Chris Heaton-Harris, the UK's Northern Ireland Secretary, said the deal featured a vast array of decent improvements and would be published on Wednesday. The legislation is expected to be fast-tracked through Westminster on Thursday. A spokesperson for Rishi Sunak said the deal was a strong basis to restore Stormont. If there are no glitches, Stormont could be recalled as early as Friday to elect an Assembly Speaker and appoint an executive drawn from Sinn Féin, the DUP, the Alliance Party and the Ulster Unionist Party. The DUP will be enlisted to the Deputy First Minister post, which has equal power to the First Minister but less prestige and symbolic weight. O'Neill said Stormont faced an urgent workload, including fiscal crisis, strikes and crumbling healthcare. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us, a slog ahead of us, but collectively we can do better for the people we serve. Collectively we can fight back against this Tory austerity agenda. Collectively we can stand up and fight hard for the public services. William, how important is it that Stormont is back up and running?
I think it's very important because it's been the effects of mothballing it have been quite damaging to the economy and to society in Northern Ireland. The strikes that you mentioned and the problem with public services and particularly the NHS, that needs to have a working devolved government in there making things happen. And I believe there is money available to make it happen, probably as a result of Theresa May's deal with the DUP back in 2018. But and that does raise questions about what happens in future years. But they need a government getting together to work on that. It's very interesting that this seems to have come out of the blue, and I'm not entirely sure to what extent the Windsor framework that was agreed with the EU has had to be tweaked in order to reach this agreement. But on the face of it, if no great complication arises, it's a very welcome step, I think.
Thank you. Claire, what is the significance of Sinn Féin taking the role of First Minister?
Well, I think what it shows is there's been a real demographic shift in Northern Ireland, and um, younger generations have a different approach to who they want to be representing them. It's certainly not without its challenges, but we know that. But this is democracy. This is what the North voted for. And I'm a firm believer that people should get the representation that they have voted for. From my point of view, as the convener of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee, we have really missed our colleagues on the interparliamentary work that we're doing. We meet in the Interparliamentary Forum with Westminster, the Lords, and the Senate, and only once have we been able to sit around the table with our colleagues from Stormont. And we should all have been observer delegates from the devolved nations at the Parliamentary Partnership Association in Europe. So the very first one that we had was the day that it was announced that they were walking away from the Good Friday Agreement, basically, which was absolutely disastrous. But we spent most of 2 days deliberating, talking mainly about the Good Friday Agreement, about Northern Ireland, about they weren't walking away from the Good Friday Agreement, but away from the original deal with the EU. So and had we had our colleagues there, they would have been in the room. They still wouldn't have been allowed a speaking position at that, as the devolved nations aren't. But it was really, we really missed them to have their observations and contribution at that time. So it's important for intergovernmental relations. The British Irish Parliamentary Association, BIPA, has become much more important in terms of how the UK operates, how we interact with our colleagues in Ireland and in Europe. And not to have that representation there, I think, has been a big loss. So knowing the research that Queen's University have done on attitudes of the people, this is what the people of the North want, is a working assembly, and I'm glad that they've been able to broker a deal that will make that happen.
Thank you. Now turning to Scotland and the UK COVID inquiry. At the UK COVID inquiry sitting in Edinburgh today, Lady Hallett heard evidence from Kate Forbes, MSP, and John Sweeney, MSP, the Deputy First Minister during the COVID pandemic. The questioning by Jamie Dawson, KC, seemed to follow the proposition that the former First Minister pushed through decisions with very little reference to her cabinet or scientific advice, accusations strongly rebuffed by Mr Sweeney. Dawson, the inquiry's Scottish counsel, alleged that the Scottish Government failed to record discussions during any of the Sturgeon's crucial gold meetings with a small handful of her advisers and senior ministers during 2020 and 2021. Lady Justice Hallett, the inquiry chair, seemed to place great importance on Kate Forbes, who was First Minister, not being invited to participate in the early Gold Group meetings. However, Miss Forbes said that although she had not been a part of the meetings, Economic Secretary Fiona Hislop did take part. A recurring theme of Jamie Dawson's questioning was that the Scottish Government put too much importance on the first or the four harms outlined in the Scottish Government's four harms strategy, an allegation refuted by Mr Sweeney. There were repeated suggestions that the Scottish Government had attempted to promote Scottish independence by managing the pandemic in Scotland differently to the UK Government. The former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, MSP, will give evidence at the inquiry tomorrow. Claire, do you think that the COVID inquiry has been getting to the bottom of the issues the both UK and Scottish governments had?
Well, I think we have to remember that the COVID inquiry is about the people of Scotland and their experience and what happened. And we will all have had experiences of friends or people that we know having the most horrendous time with the loss of a loved one during COVID. And we have to be very respectful of that. So I do hope that the inquiry continues to dig to get to the bottom of some of the decisions that were made, and we'll come to a conclusion about what happened. But I do also feel that a focus on, individual WhatsApps on a day-to-day basis and what people might have said and what they thought would be a private conversation that would never come isn't really what the families want. They want to know that decisions were taken in their relatives' best interests and that the protection of the people was foremost in what was happening. It's a complicated situation because the purse strings for a lot of the work that was put in place, like furlough, were held at Westminster. So keeping pace or moving further was always going to be difficult for the Scottish Government. But what I remember is that people coming up to me in the street at the time, thanking me, asking me to thank Nicola for appearing every day and for our government to be held to account every day in the broadcasts, with questionings from journalists, and giving explanations about where they were and why they'd made the decisions that they had. And I think it's marked contrast to the behaviours at Westminster and phrases like "let the bodies pile up," which we are not seeing at all from anything from the Scottish Government.
Thank you. William, do you think that the inquiry has been a good value for taxpayers' money?
Well, it hasn't finished yet, and hopefully it will be good value for taxpayers' money. But I would tend to agree pretty well with what Clare said about what we're seeing right now. I'm not sure always what we're getting from the inquiry, and bear in mind this could be what the mainstream media reporting is telling us rather than what's actually going on. But I'm not sure that it really is yet getting to the heart of what the families need to hear, and what really the public needs to hear. The public needs to hear that we have taken account of the way in which decisions were made and what the decisions were, and as a result of that, we know how we need to prepare for the next pandemic, because there will be one. It might be in 6 months, it might be in 60 years, it might not be anybody currently alive, anything that they currently see, but it will happen. And I think without fear or favour, we should get to the bottom of what might have gone wrong, understanding maybe why it went wrong, because it was an unprecedented situation, but something solid about how it can be put right again. And I'm not sure that talk about WhatsApps is really all that relevant, or ever has been. It maybe has been interesting for the public in some way, but it's not helpful for the public. So the value of the inquiry will be apparent at the end, and hopefully it will be manifested in something concrete that we do differently, and that's the important thing.
Thank you. We're going to now turn to Holyrood, where they had a debate on independent Scotland in the EU. At a Scottish Parliament debate in Holyrood today, External Affairs Secretary Angus Robertson called on MSPs to affirm Scotland's future in the European Union. Mr. Robertson will invite Parliament to note the proposals in the Scottish Government paper, An Independent Scotland in the EU, the 7th paper in the Building a New Scotland series. As further studies highlight the impact of Brexit on the UK economy and the cost of living crisis, Mr. Robson asked Parliament to agree that Scotland's economic, social and political future is best served by being part of the European Union. Speaking ahead of the debate, Mr. Robson said the Scottish Parliament repeatedly expressed its support for remaining in the EU and the single market, and yet the people of Scotland and their elected Parliament were ignored time and time again. According to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the UK economy is 2.5% smaller as a result of Brexit, equating to a cut of around £2.3 billion in public revenue for Scotland. Cambridge Econometrics estimates this damage will continue and reach 10% of gross value added GVA by 2035. During the debate, Scottish Labour tabled an amendment which avoided taking a pro-EU position, despite Anna Sawar having said in 2017 that permanent membership of the single market and customs union would address the economic deficit which would come from Brexit. Last week, a report commissioned by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, found that the cost of Brexit to the UK economy was £140 billion, with the average person almost £2,000 worse off. Mr. Khan has called on the UK government to urgently build a closer relationship with the EU. Claire, if Scotland was to become independent, how long would it take for them to rejoin the EU?
Well, this is a question that is frequently asked, and we can't give a definitive answer in the circumstance that everything is hypothetical at the moment. But I do know that accession states have to be in alignment with the acquis of the European Union, which we have been, and which the Scottish Government passed legislation to ensure that we will be. So I think, we'd be very well placed to have a quick rejoining of the European Union. And even in that intervening period, when we're keeping pace with European legislation, European regulation, we'll be in a good position to be trading before full accession as well, I am sure, because it's a unique situation where we will be wanting to come back in, having left previously. But there's many European observers think that this will be the right thing for Scotland. I am so frustrated because I've just talked about the interparliamentary work that we do with our colleagues from across the devolved nations and from Westminster and the House of Lords. But I'm so frustrated because we have spent a lot of time at these assemblies cherry picking things that we had when we were in the European Union. We had before Brexit things like youth movement, freedom of movement from visas and the cabotage for our touring artists. Horizon was a big one. We now have Horizon and Comenius back there, but we don't have Erasmus Plus, which is something else we're missing. So we're now talking about how do we reinstate that. And meanwhile, all the major benefits that were supposed to come with Brexit, there's nothing to show. The economic figures speak for themselves. And now people know how much more difficult it is to travel, the charges that are there, passport queues, all the things that we see in our day-to-day lives now as a part of a nation that has left the European Union. So I hope it will be quick, and I hope that it will not be a protracted process. But I do think I joined the SNP because they had a policy of independence in Europe, and I represent Motherwell and Wishaw. That's where I grew up. And Ravenscraig was shut because of steel quotas. But I knew as a small independent nation, Scotland could have saved its steel industry, saved the Ravenscraig plant, like Ireland, like Finland, like other small European nations. And I think we'd be best placed to be independent and in Europe.
Thank you. William, do you think we're more likely to see an independent Scotland or the UK rejoin the EU?
That's an interesting one. I would very much hope the former, because I would hope that we would be getting towards an independent Scotland really quite soon. The Yes movement really needs to be campaigning quite hard for that this year in order to get the popular support up to the level where it becomes a lot more necessary. Right now, there's no sign of the UK wanting to rejoin the European Union. It's not supported, certainly, by the Conservatives and not supported by Labour, and it doesn't even seem to be supported by the Lib Dems right now. So Labour, if they get in, I think will try to do a wee bit better with Brexit, get marks for artistic merit, if you like, but it's debatable just how easy that will be, because Brexit is still a process. We haven't yet seen the full effects of Brexit because just tomorrow we're seeing the new import rules coming in for plant and animal products with more physical checks to follow in April. And we don't yet know how that's going to pan out in terms of supplies of goods on the shelves. So one of the reasons I think that it's been quite slow for people in the UK in general, it's never been a problem for people in Scotland who didn't vote for Brexit in the first place, but for people in the UK in general to come across the idea that Brexit is a bad thing is because it's been salami slice introduced. You haven't had all the bad effects at once. And maybe once all the bad effects are on board and there is popular support, there will be a really strong push by the people to get back, for the UK to get back. If Scotland becomes independent and joins the EU, I'd be quite happy for the UK to join us all later on. That would be lovely. But I think Scotland's independence will come first, if I'm honest.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to the IMF, who warned Jeremy Hunt against UK budget tax cuts. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has issued a strong warning to UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt against cutting taxes in his March the 6th budget, stressing the need to boost key areas of public spending instead. In an updated forecast for the UK and the rest of the global economy, the Washington-based IMF doubted whether the widely anticipated tax cuts would be possible without post-election spending cuts. The IMF said that the Chancellor should be focusing on repairing the public finances after the damage caused by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine in order to meet growing spending pressures. An IMF spokesperson said, reserving high-quality public services and undertaking critical public investment to boost growth and achieve the net zero targets will imply higher spending needs over the medium term than are currently reflected in the government's budget plans. Accommodating these needs while assuredly stabilising the debt-to-GDP ratio will already require generating additional high-quality fiscal savings, including on the tax side. Jeremy Hunt is expected to cut income tax in the budget, but the IMF called on the Chancellor to increase carbon and property taxes, take steps to eliminate loopholes in the taxation of wealth and income, and overhaul the pensions triple lock. It is in this context that IMF staff advises against further taxes, the IMF said. The IMF said it was forecasting weak growth in the UK of 0.5% in 2023 and 0.6% in 2024, unchanged from their October forecast, and with only Germany of the leading G7 industrialised economies expanding more weakly. Claire, what will be the impact on cuts to public service on the money the UK government gives to the Scottish government?
So there's no doubt that the budget that we're about to receive from the Tories will be an election budget, and they will be looking to influence how people will vote. And for the Tories, that generally means tax cuts. So those tax cuts, that means less money available to them. So it'll impact on what happens here in Scotland. We already know that this is one of the tightest budget settlements that the Scottish Government has had to deal with. And we know that it will impact on public services here at a time when we really, really need more money for our health service, more money for local government. And so it's very difficult decisions that are having to be made by our government. We are always going to be in a difficult situation without the full levers of our economy, without having control of all those fiscal powers. And we also have the situation of the Levelling Up Fund, which used to be the European money, which the UK government is going directly to local authorities with, bypassing the democratic process for areas where the Scottish Parliament do have responsibility. So things are getting very complicated and very messy as a result of this. Now, we have been able to manage up until now without strikes in the health service, with junior doctors here not going out on strike. So the pay settlements have been challenging. The big challenge for us going forward with the announcements following the budget as it will be set in March is that, we will have calls from the opposition to say we're letting everybody down. But the question for them is, well, where do they want to take the money from? Because the priorities, I think, are right that have been set by the government. The health service has to be our priority.
Thank you. William, do you think it's time we reflect on how much we tax wealth in the UK?
Yes, I think we should. I think what we've been doing for the last certainly 12 years, 13 years under the Tories, is redistributing wealth in favour of the rich and taking money away from the poor. And we really do need to look at where, if we are generating extra tax income, that comes from. Taxing wealth is certainly one of them. And I would say that tax cuts for the already wealthy are not a good idea. I don't think they promote growth particularly, because the money tends to be squirreled away in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere. What might achieve growth is public spending to repair our public services. And of course, that would have consequences, Barnett consequentials rather, for Scotland as well, and is possibly the way forward. But to get back to your original question, I'm all for a wealth tax of some sort, because it does mean that you don't just get money squirreled away. That money can be made to work for the British economy, or the Scottish economy if it comes to it, just as efficiently as anything else. So we'll see what happens on March the 6th. I rather think that Jeremy Hunt will go down the tax cutting route, which will be a shame, because I don't think it will achieve its objective.
What changes do you think Labour will make? This can be to any of you two.
Do you mean if they get elected?
Yeah.
So, what concerns me is that some of the most objectionable policies to me that have been brought in by the Tory government, like the two-child tax limit and the rape clause, as it's commonly called, they've already said they're not going to do anything about that. They're not going to introduce the child payment universally across the UK, which has been shown to be one of the best ways of tackling inequality and helping families and children out of poverty. So I just see them as being Tory light at the moment, and I don't hold out any great hope that they'll be making significant changes that will mean that Scotland receives the settlement and Barnett consequentials and the settlement that means we can make a big transformation. In the area of migration, I think they may have a different policy, and that would all help. I'm very concerned about the rule that will be introduced shortly that will prevent students bringing their families here, because I know in my area there are lots of people who work in our care service who are the wives or husbands of students who are here. So I think that's one area where they would have a possibility, but how much better it would be if we just had control of migration for Scotland's needs and for our own country. And I think we'd be in a much better position.
Thank you. William?
I think Claire's got it right there. I think Rachel Reeves, as putative Chancellor, has bought into the neoliberal way of looking at things, which means you either have to cut taxes or you have to reduce spending. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And there are economists such as Richard Murphy who don't agree with that either. I don't think you should go wild, but there is a case for saying just looking at the debt as something that needs to be brought down is not necessarily the best way of making it a better life for people here. And I am not optimistic about Labour going by their statements right now. Maybe they will surprise us if they get in, but I'm not holding my breath.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to Europe. The Eurozone avoids recession. Official figures show that the 20-nation Eurozone has avoided recession despite the region's economy flatlining at the end of 2023. Zero growth in the single currency zone in the final quarter of last year followed a 0.1% economic contraction in the third quarter, meaning that recession, defined as 2 consecutive quarters of contraction, was averted. Economists polled by Reuters had predicted the Eurozone's economy to shrink by 0.1% in the fourth quarter. The Eurozone's two biggest economies both performed poorly in the late 2023, with Germany contracting by 0.3% and France posting no growth for a second successive quarter, according to the Eurostat, the EU statistical agency. There was better news from the other two members of the Eurozone's Big Four. Italy had been expected to stagnate, recorded growth of 0.2%, while Spain expanded by 0.6%, 3 times the 0.2% forecast. Of the smaller Eurozone economies, Portugal grew by 0.8% in the final quarter, Austria expanded by 0.2%, Ireland's economy contracted by 0.7%, its fourth successive quarterly fall in 2003. Claire.
I think... sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, why do you think Europe is struggling so much with its growth at the moment?
Well, I think we've got to consider the geopolitical situation that we're in at the moment. Ukraine has had a big impact on fuel supply from Russia. We've had a big impact on grain prices and the ongoing situation there, where Germany and the rest of Europe have, and particularly, stepped up in a big way to ensure that they're supporting the displaced Ukrainians that are staying in Europe at the moment. So the geopolitical part of it will have played a big part. I also think we're having to get used to global warming and patterns of holidaying and people moving around Europe during the holiday periods is changing, because we're seeing situations where it's so hot in the summer that perhaps some of the tourist income for some of the places has fallen away, because people are choosing to holiday at different times or go to different places. So there's lots happening, and it's all part of that ecosystem that we're living in at the moment. Generally, I think COVID and the effects of that across the whole of Europe, including in this country, is that people are less likely to be spending money, more cautious about purchases, more cautious about holidays and things. So that will have an impact across the whole of the European continent as people had to live with lockdowns and everything else. So it's like a microcosm of what's happening here. Fuel prices are increasing. Fuel security is a worry. Security in general is a worry. So I think people are just being perhaps a bit more cautious as well. But there is growth and there's opportunity, and we have a huge amount of research happening in areas such as robotics, potential for the Scottish space industry. We have the neurosciences, all these things. Big announcement from Elon Musk today about possibilities for neuroscience. So I think we have to remember that the economies will recover as people start to reinvest and to move forward with the new technologies of I mean, we called it the fourth industrial revolution. That's almost past us. We're almost on to the fifth. So we have to ensure that we all keep competitive and are moving forward in those areas.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to Spain, who are voting on amnesty laws for Catalan pro-independence politicians. Spanish MPs are preparing to vote on the amnesty law for pro-independence Catalan politicians, which enabled the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's socialist-led coalition government to secure a second term in office after last year's inconclusive general election. The draft law covers about 400 people involved in the symbolic, consultative and unilateral independence referendum of the November 2014 and the poll that came 3 years later. It was followed by a unilateral declaration of independence that resulted in Spain jailing many of the senior independence politicians and campaigners. The former Catalan president, Carl Puigdemont, fled to Belgium to avoid arrest over his leading role in leading the campaign for Catalan independence from Spain in 2017. Although the Conservative People's Party, PP, narrowly defeated Sanchez's Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, PSOE, in last July's elections, it was unable to form a government, even with the backing of the far-right Vox Party. Sanchez was returned to office in an investiture debate last November after securing the backing of the two main Catalan pro-independence parties, Puigdemont centre-right Junts Party and the Catalan Republic left ERC, in return for promising the amnesty law. If the bill is approved in Congress, where Sanchez and his allies have a narrow majority, it will still have to go before the Senate, where the right-wing PP has a majority. Once law, the amnesty will be applied by judges on a case-by-case basis. William, what do you think Labour can learn from PSOE about working with independence parties?
Well, it should learn that it would be a very good idea to work with pro-independence parties if those parties are elected in sufficient numbers as to provide some form of balance of power. I don't think it will happen in a million years. To a certain extent, Pedro Sanchez has been forced into this because there was no other way he could get himself a majority in the Congress. And it's not a popular measure, I have to say, either. Many Spanish people are against it. Personally, I think an amnesty is a fine thing, but it's not popular in Spain, and I suspect if it goes through in Congress, which it probably will, it will fail in the Senate, where the People's Party has a majority. But it's a very interesting development, let's put it that way. And yes, I would like to see some creative thinking from Labour, how they interact with the SNP should they be elected as government in 2024 stroke early 25.
Thank you. Claire, just quickly, why is it important that these politicians are actually giving amnesty?
Well, I think we were all appalled by the scenes from the independence referendum when we saw the violence against people who were peacefully wanting to go to vote or involved in the movement. And it's a democratic outrage and a reminder to us how precious democracy is and rule of law as we go forward with our own independence campaign. And absolutely, they have been forced into it. But nonetheless, Catalan is a shining example of a region of Spain as it is now that has a federal autonomy that we don't have in this in our relationship with the UK, and that is absolutely thriving. I mean, they have an incredible economy. They're very well placed to look after their own affairs. And should the Catalan people vote for that in a referendum in the future, they absolutely deserve to make that choice going forward, as does Scotland and any other nation. I think what we were talking about the UK election earlier on and what kind of budget might be brought forward. It's more difficult for us to have that influence because we have an archaic voting system. and it's first past the post for Westminster, which always means that the Scottish bloc, as it were, even when it was mainly SNP, very, very difficult for them to have an influence at Westminster because the voting system that they have there, which also means that we have elections frequently and changes of government and Prime Minister. And that all, I think, is really detrimental to our economy and where we are in the UK. And I think it reminds us that, voting elsewhere can be done differently. And I think, I'm glad that this result has resulted in something that I believe is undoing an injustice that was done to the Catalan politicians at that time.
Thank you very much. 14 million pounds funding for marine and fishing businesses has been provided by the Scottish Government. Businesses and marine organisations in Scotland's coastal communities will benefit from £14 million in grants from the Marine Fund Scotland in 2023 to 2024. A total of 91 projects with grants ranging from just under £1,000 up to £1.6 million will support innovation and sustainable practices for the marine economy, including work to reduce carbon emissions. Projects include modernising seafood processes, facilities to reduce energy and increase efficiencies, harbour improvements supported by communities, clean-ups and marine litter prevention work to aid decarbonisation, new marine research to drive innovation using the latest available technology and data to protect wild salmon and manage non-native invasive species, announcing the recipients of the fund, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, Marie Goujon said the successful organisation and individuals are helping to drive innovation in the marine sector and support coastal communities, and I am pleased to confirm such a wide variety of recipients. Now in its third year, Marine Fund Scotland has enabled a range of exciting and pioneering projects designed to support our marine ecosystems, improve economic prosperity and enhance social inclusion, all key pillars of our blue economy vision. We are committed to maintaining the full allocation of the Marine Fund Scotland, but an independent Scotland within the EU receiving pre-Brexit level of funding could do much better support our seafood and marine industries. It is time that the UK government provided the sector with their equitable and rightful share of funding so that the projects like these can continue long into the future. We will continue to press them to do so. The funding includes various of harbours from Wick to Eyemouth. Fraserburgh Harbour, home to the Moray East Offshore Wind Farm Marine Base, received nearly £1.2 million for the harbour wall improvements and a marine litter project. How important is this money in securing a green future for the Scottish Government, Clare?
Well, I think it's really important. You'll forgive me if I'm not an expert on marine and coastal areas, being in central Scotland in Motherwell and Wishaw. However, I do know that what's really important about this money in this fund is it's been done in partnership with the local areas and working really closely with the producers and with the communities in the area. Our marine landscape has changed beyond all recognition from what was perhaps a trawling, fishing, seafood production area and fishing and collection in that respect, to now being as an industrial space with wind farms, with wave technology, and what we know about ecology as well, about some of the impacts that may have on our coastal waters and the wildlife within that. So I think this is a good step forward. I'm glad it's been maintained, and I really welcome what appears to be a really good partnership arrangement with the government and with the communities that are being supported by it.
Thank you. William, can I end on a note from you?
Yeah, I agree with Claire about the importance of the bill. It is interesting just how UK funding is always skimpier than EU funding. I would hope that an independent Scotland, even before it's in the EU, could do better than this, using all the levers, all the financial levers, and perhaps in its early years, a significant amount of deficit spending to build the economy back up to where it should be. But this is a good development, and it's part of the blue economy vision, which stretches out over the next 20 years, which is important for us all.
Thank you. Well, that is it for us this evening. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has donated to our emergency crowdfunder over the past 2 weeks. We are now only £2,000 short of our target and very hopeful that we will reach £10,000 by the end of this week. Although the immediate pressure has now been eased and we can now focus on securing future of independent broadcasting for Scotland, our need to grow our subscriber base and increase our funding is still urgent. Good night and thank you for watching.
Thank you.